marginalized communities. Yadira's dedication to understanding and addressing housing policies, coupled with her firsthand experience exploring the impacts of redlining and eviction rates, underscores her commitment to advocating for the rights and needs of historically marginalized communities. Please join me in welcoming Yadira.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute's Capitol Hill Briefing Series. My name is Yadira Guzman. I am currently the CHI Housing Perspective Fellow, and I am really excited to be moderating this panel discussion entitled Renting the American Dream, alongside some incredible and amazing experts who are doing incredible work in the housing field. I want to start off by thanking each and every one of you for being here and joining in our conversation today. Our discussion will focus on some affordable housing challenges such as displacement, the nationwide affordable housing shortage, and historical racist policies that have contributed to the inequalities that we still see today, such as the homeownership and wealth gaps. And currently, the housing crisis in the United States is ever growing, with an estimated national shortage of 7.3 million affordable and available rental homes for low-income renters. And in fact, the number of white renter households who could afford payments on the U.S. median priced home fell by 30% between March of 2022 and March of 2023. The number of Black and Hispanic renter households in the same group dropped by 39 and 37% respectively. The Black and Hispanic homeownership rates are still fully 28 and 25 percentage points below the homeownership rates for their counterparts. And in 2020, the typical white person lives in a neighborhood where people of color made up less than a third of the population, while the typical Black and Hispanic person lived in a neighborhood that was 2/3 people of color. So what is that telling us, right? We're still living in highly segregated neighborhoods and communities in this nation. And so addressing these multifaceted challenges requires comprehensive policy solutions aimed at promoting equity and combating discrimination, and expanding access to affordable housing for all Americans. To help us understand and address some of these critical issues, I would like to now introduce and pass on the mic to my incredible set of panelists. And Sid, if we could start with you, if you would like to introduce yourself, your organization, and the incredible work you do, and then we can just go down the line.
Of course. So hi, everybody. My name is Sid Betancourt. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a project manager for inclusive community engagement at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, also known as NLIHC, where we're dedicated to achieving racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes have quality homes that are both affordable and accessible in communities of their choice. And I just want to thank again Yadira and CHCI for bringing us all here today. I was a CHCI fellow about 3 years ago now, so it's an honor to be in this space with you all and to be sharing the space. And I will be talking today a little bit more about the housing issues impacting renters across the country, but as our name suggests, at NLIHC, we focus on the lowest income household because our research shows that that is where the greatest needs are. And so NLIHC is known for two big research reports that we publish every year. The first one is called The Gap, and Yadira kind of touched on this a little bit, but this really just touches on the shortage of affordable housing. So there is a shortage of 7.3 million homes that are affordable and accessible to the lowest income households. And that includes folks that are making at or below 30% of the area median income. And nationally, there are only 33 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income households. And out of all the extremely low income households in the United States, 13% of those are Latino households. And the impacts of both discrimination and oppression not only show up in homeownership disparities, as we just talked about, and we'll continue to talk about in this panel, but also in the disparities amongst Latino renters. We talk a lot about wages and income at the coalition as well, and as we see within like the yearly income that Latinos make, they make about 15K less than their white counterparts, which makes a huge difference. And renters of color, which also include Latinos, are more likely to be cost burdened. And just to put a definition to that, if folks don't know what that means, it means that folks are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs, which in our case, we rented as rent, or we defined it as rent and utilities. And 53% of Latinos in the United States are considered cost burden. And that leads to higher rates of eviction and homelessness amongst Latinos as well. And then I also mentioned that there were 2 reports, but I want to talk about one. The second one is called Out of Reach, and that is known for calculating the hourly housing wage that a renter must earn to afford a modest rental home in the United States. And I think Aaliyah kind of alluded to this if you were here for the previous panel, but the national housing wage right now for this year that we calculated for 1-bedroom apartment is $23.67, and to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment is $28.58. So, we use a lot of this research to advocate for policy priorities, which we encapsulate in this really huge campaign called the House Campaign. And it really works to advance anti-racist policies that would create not just large scale, but also sustainable investments and robust investments towards reforms that would ensure renters have access to affordable place to call home. So this includes 4 different priorities. The first one is bridging the gap between incomes and housing costs by providing rental assistance to every eligible household. The second is expanding and preserving the supply of rental homes, affordable and accessible to the people with the lowest incomes. The third is providing rental assistance to households in times of crisis, because as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of households are just one financial shock away from losing their homes or falling into economic hardship. And then the fourth, and last but not least, is strengthening and enforcing renter protections, because there is a very big power imbalance that exists between renters and landlords, and that can put people at higher risk for experiencing homelessness or housing instability. So at the coalition, one of the biggest ways that we work towards these solutions is by advocating for the highest level of funding possible for both housing and homelessness programs in every fiscal budget. And obviously right now we're focusing on fiscal year 2025. But we also really care about other key legislations that would make these priorities a reality, such as the Ending Homelessness Act, which would ensure rental assistance is universally available, the Housing Crisis Response Act, which would include the $150 billion proposed in the Build Back Better Act to build and preserve affordable housing, the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act, which would create emergency rental assistance to prevent eviction and homelessness, and then the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which would create an additional 250,000 vouchers for families with young ones who need, more choice in where they live. And then one of the biggest things that's not necessarily related to our congressional advocacy, but is still really important to highlight, I think, especially right now, is that there is a Supreme Court case that will be heard on April 22nd, 2024, called Johnson versus Grants Pass, which will decide whether cities are allowed to punish folks for, sleeping with on the street with like a pillow or a blanket, and especially if there's no safe shelter. And if you live in DC, I really do encourage you to join the rally that we're going to have on April 22nd on the Supreme Court case to fight against criminalization of homelessness across the country. And you can find out more information about that at johnsonvgrantspass.com, and that's johnsonvgrantspass.com. And again, I know I'm going to have a lot of opportunity to talk about this, but I really just want to harp in on the anti-racist reforms that really need to pass in order for any of these programs to serve Latinos, to serve the Black community, to serve other communities of color, such as passing federal source of income protections, which would stop landlords from discriminating against people who use federal subsidies to pay for their housing, and also investing in fair housing investment, which I'm sure Shanti will touch on a little bit later, and expanding access to immigrant households and mixed status households. So again, thank you, Yadira and CHCI, for having me here, and I look forward to digging in a little deeper.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Lila, if you want to
Hello, hi everyone. So yeah, thank you so much to CHCI for inviting me to be part of today's conversation. Really excited to be here. Again, I'm Laura Arce. I'm Senior Vice President for Economic Initiatives out of Unidos US. For those of you who have been to the CHCI building, we are the building right next door with the big red wall. So, just wave when you walk by. Unidos US, who here has not heard of Unidos US? Okay, I feel like with this audience, you guys know who we are, but one thing I will say, kind of this feels we're the country's, longest serving, Hispanic serving civil rights organization. And, one thing about us is that we're a multi-issue organization. So I find that most people know us in kind of the work, the way they interact with us. So some folks think of us as an immigrant rights group or as a workforce development program or sort of a certain different area. So we work on lots of different things. Including housing, education, workforce, immigration, voter and civic engagement. The way we do the work that we do is across a few capabilities. One is policy and advocacy, another is communications, another is program areas, and then another is around communications and storytelling, through our various platforms. Housing has long been an institutional priority for the organization. We've been around over 55 years, and for most of that time, we've done some level of work in the housing space. As you know, housing is a spectrum, right? And so there's a lot of different issue areas within the housing space. I focus on homeownership. Here's what Sid, she's definitely the rental expert side. I focus more on the homeownership side. If you were here for the earlier session, you would have heard from my colleague Fatima, who talked about our initiative, Homeownership Means Equity, which is our bold movement to help create 4 million new Latino homeowners this decade. And I'll share a little bit first maybe about why Unidos is focused so squarely on Latino homeownership, and then I'll talk about kind of what that work means. The first is you know, about earlier today, homeownership it's not the only path, but it's the primary way for building generational wealth in this country, particularly for lower and middle income families and immigrant families, and homeownership is that first step toward building generational wealth. A second important factor, which I'm sure Shanti, will speak more to because this is more her area of expertise, is that we've seen a lot of significant positive correlation between accessing quality housing, in particular homeownership, to lots of other opportunities. So whether it's access to quality education, to grocery stores for not being in a food desert, to workforce opportunities, to civic engagement, even positive health outcomes. But I think a third really important reason for why we focus on homeownership is that we know that homeownership is a priority for our community. And I was really moved by Congresswoman Ramirez's remarks from earlier today. And I think I talk to folks across the country, particularly Latino communities, about homeownership a lot. And I have yet to meet someone who doesn't have a really powerful story of their family's U.S. story in homeownership. Whether achieving homeownership or how that continues to be the goal, it's something that just culturally is really important to us. And I think, certainly there's the wealth building aspect of it, but I think also, homeownership for us, it represents familia, it represents stability, it represents belonging. Like we're here, we own a piece of this country. And so I think there's something much deeper and emotional, that connection to homeownership. So we know it's a priority for our community, and that's why it's a priority for Unidos US. So the Home Initiative, it's a multi-year initiative. We have this long-term goal that we're reaching forward for 2030, and we're organizing our work in a few different ways. One is around policy and advocacy, and so we have a federal policy agenda. We're also beginning policy work at a couple of states, in California and Arizona specifically, and we heard earlier in the panel about the importance of state and local policy in the housing space, which is very true. A second area of work is around research. So we've partnered with the Urban Institute. They're one of the leading think tanks in DC for sure, probably in the country, focused on homeownership and closing the homeownership gap and identifying evidence-based solutions for that. So we're working very closely with them. We just, the Urban Institute just about a month ago published a paper on mortgage lending for ITIN holders, which we funded through our initiative. So it's one example of the type of work that we're doing with them. A third space that we're focused on is around communications. And so we think it's really important to tell the story of our community not just how important homeownership is for us, but how important it is for this country. We know what the demographic trends are in this country. We know how important housing is to our GDP and to the economic growth of this country. And if we continue to allow the homeownership gap to persist or even to grow, that's going to be detrimental to our overall GDP and economy. And so we try and push a message around how promoting and supporting Latino homeownership is not just good for Latinos, it's good for the country as a whole. So that's part of the storytelling that we do. And then a third really important piece of the work, something Fatima touched on earlier, is community-based investments. And so there's certainly a lot of really important work we can do from Washington. But at the end of the day, houses get built in local communities. And we know that the opportunities and the challenges in, LA are very different from Wisconsin, from Florida, rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas. And so we're really fortunate to have our affiliate network of 300 organizations, and they're doing some really innovative and exciting things. And so we're working directly with local communities, supporting their efforts, whether it's around expanding education to prepare, families to become homeowners, or whether they're building affordable housing or focus on the policy end. So that's some of the work we're doing. I certainly encourage you on the Unidos US website, do unidosUS.org/homeownership. That's our home website. You can get lots of more information on that, and also subscribe to our quarterly newsletter, which will share some of the specific activities. I did want to take also a minute to just say a little bit about myself. So I've been at Unidos a couple of years, 2 years. I just had my 2-year anniversary. I am what we call a boomerang employee, and there are actually a lot of us at Unidos. We started our career there, went off, did really amazing things. We were able to get that Unidos on our resume, and then we came back because we're just so passionate about the organization and the work. I've worked in the federal government. I've worked in private industry. I've worked with other nonprofits. I've been really fortunate the experience that I've had, and I'm really happy to be able to bring that back to the work that I do now. I'll share during the housing crisis years, which maybe we'll touch on a little bit later, kind of some of those lessons learned. I was at the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is a regulator of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and so we were on the front lines of fixing our housing system to try and preserve as many homeowners as we could in the midst of a crisis. And so I just want to share a little about that. And, for me personally, I'm from California. My grandparents are the ones who came to this country in the early 1950s. And they were never homeowners. They lived their entire adult lives, raised children, and they were never homeowners. And I thought back about that more recently, kind of like why? Because they could have been, they lived in the same house for decades. And they had opportunities to become homeowners. But I really think there was something mentally where they felt it wasn't for them. They felt always kind of othered in this country. And so for me, a lot of my life's work is focused on making sure that, other families have full access to opportunities. And for me personally, I think to my parents, they made 2 decisions which really transformed my life's trajectory. One is they went to college, and the second is they bought a house. My grandparents were, my grandfather was a manual laborer, my grandmothers were service workers, and then you go to my generation, and I'm sitting here in Rayburn House Office Building. I mean, that's really incredible, just in 2 generations, and I really do attribute a lot of that to the choices that my parents made in that in-between generation, and I want more families to have that same access to opportunities. That's why I do what I do. Thank you.
Laura, for sharing and all the work that you do. I want to hand it over to Shanti to introduce herself and the organization's incredible work she does as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Shanti Abedin. I'm the Vice President of Housing and Community Development at the National Fair Housing Alliance. I'm going to steal Laura's term as a boomerang employee. I was at NAFA from 2010 to 2017, so dealing with a lot of the aftermath of the foreclosure crisis and how it affected communities of color around the country, and then came back about 2 years ago as well. So my current title, again, is the Vice President of Housing and Community Development at the National Fair Housing Alliance. We're a national civil rights organization, and the only national national organization dedicated entirely to ending housing discrimination in all of its forms. And so we do that in a number of different ways. We have our public policy and advocacy team. We actually support a membership network of about 100 fair housing centers that work in states and cities across the country, taking discrimination complaints and helping parents across the country as well as doing policy work. We do enforcement of the Fair Housing Act and a number of other things. And my team is a relatively new team, but the team is focused on taking settlements from fair housing cases and reinvesting those back into communities in a way that really aims to redress or, really consider the discrimination that's occurred and destabilize communities. And we also have a few of our signature programs. One is the Keys Unlock Dreams Initiative, which is dedicated to closing the homeownership gap and wealth gaps for particularly Black and Latino families. And it's not just getting them into homeownership, but it's also making sure that they're set up for success. We know that people of color, Latinos and Black families in particular, are more likely to not be able to pass that wealth on to their next generation for a variety of reasons, right? So we're really dedicated not only to getting people in the door of homeownership, but making sure that results in intergenerational change and wealth building over time. So again, at NAFA, our work is centered around the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was passed 1968, 55 years ago. And it has two parts. One is to make discrimination against a set number of protected classes illegal. And the second is really about this recognition from our government that we need to not only make it illegal to discriminate, but put efforts into place to really proactively or affirmatively ensure that fair housing is a reality. So combating things like the segregation that was left in our communities due to discrimination for decades, for centuries in some cases, and then also ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to live in a neighborhood of choice, and that every neighborhood is invested in equally or in equal manners. Because as Laura mentioned, we know that neighborhoods are very segregated, and that where you live is so important in terms of your life trajectory, your safety, your health, your ability to build wealth, et cetera. So that's just a little bit about our work overall. I'm sure we'll get more into it. I know you're probably eager to get to the questions, so I'll pass it back to you.
All for sharing about your work and your organizations and the incredible stuff y'all are doing and some personal lived experiences as well in this housing field. So at this point, I will start the Q&A session, and then we'll have time later on for audience Q&A. So please be thinking of questions to ask our incredible set of panelists. And I'll start off and kick off this first question to you, Laura and Sid. Can y'all speak to what are the primary factors contributing to the shortage of affordable housing for many across the nation, and what specific challenges do Latino individuals and families face in accessing affordable housing? And Laura, if you would like to start and talk about homeownership.
Yes, so this in my mind is one of the top civil rights issues we're facing right now, is a shortage of affordable housing. And just a little bit of kind of table setting, there are lots of different figures out there depending on, who, Freddie Mac, National Association of Realtors, but we're about 4 million housing units short of where we should be in terms of the demand and need for housing in this country, give or take, depending on whose numbers you use. Another measure, back in the day, homeownership, the way we would sort of measure whether we had a healthy balance of homes open in the market was what people call a 6-month supply. So 6-month supply in terms of homes for purchase at any given point. That represented a pretty balanced market between home buyers and home sellers, like no one was more advantaged over the other. In recent years, we've been at like 1 month, 1.5 month supply. So it just was how short we've been that way for a very, very long time. There are a few big driving forces for that. One is some of the historical trends. And so I mentioned earlier the foreclosure crisis. When the foreclosure crisis hit in like 2007, 8, 9, that completely, the housing business has always been a cycle. that was just such a deep drop in the cycle and made housing a very, very unprofitable business. No one wanted to be in housing space. Construction businesses went out of work. People who used to be, in the industry, whether they're construction workers or even like, electricians or plumbers, found new jobs because they couldn't get hired in that industry. We have yet to recover from that. And so just the infrastructure for building houses, we don't have the right infrastructure in place. So we're continuing, every year we're adding to that shortage of homes. A second big pressure has been just demographics. In 2015, that's when millennials came of age into their prime home buying years. So right as we saw this sharp decrease in supply, we started seeing an increase in demand, just demographically, in that population. And then you have these contributing factors, just with, particularly during the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, the high cost of construction, whether it was timber, labor, materials, labor, of course, and then you add to that things like zoning restrictions and just regulations that extend the time it takes to build a house and the cost to build a house. So all those factors together, I mean, there's not one single reason, which means, of course, there isn't just one easy button solution to the challenge either. I'll then add that Latinos face additional barriers. Structurally, we know that there are significant income and wealth gaps between Latinos and white households, which contribute significantly to what we can afford, especially in this time with the high cost of housing. A second piece is Latinos tend to be, we're more likely to live in high cost states like California and Florida and places where it's particularly challenging to buy a house. And then you layer on that, individual challenges by family. So for some families, language is a barrier, being able to access, information in Spanish, to understand, perhaps immigration status, particularly even mixed status families aren't able to access traditional mortgage credit in the same way that many of us in this room can. You have the issue of multi-generational households. So do we find a house that suits the family's needs, but then also it's more complicated. We are pulling together income sources from different people. Maybe some folks are self-employed or have multiple gig jobs. All of that adds complexity to the mortgage process. And for a lot of mortgage lenders, they don't want to bother. And so all of those kind of factors adding together really just contribute to the shortage in housing and the challenges in accessing homeownership for Latino families.
And a lot of what Laura just talked about, even though it's like directly connected to homeownership, also impacts renters really deeply. And at NLHC, we really focus on like two specific issues that impact like the housing shortage, and it really is, again, just like the lack of affordable and accessible homes to folks who are extremely low income, but it's also like available like resources to folks who might need like that extra help to maintain their housing. So again, like a lot of that really goes into like the development of housing and making sure that the housing is actually targeted for folks who need it the most. And when it comes to wages too, I do really want to like draw a bigger picture for y'all. It is a big barrier for Latinos and their families as well. And according to our research, Latino workers earn about 8% less than the lowest wage workers who identify as white. And that's just like the lowest income level. As you start going further up the income ladder, you'll see wider disparities. So when you look at medium Latino workers, they make about 24% less than the medium white worker. And so with those disparities, folks will have like a harder time actually maintaining their housing. And when emergencies come up, it's really hard to even pay for those emergencies because you're so focused on paying your rent. So like, let's say at the 60th percentile, let's say a full-time worker is making $30 an hour with 17 cents. And that's enough, if you guys remember what I said earlier. I said a lot of numbers, but if you remember what I said earlier, that's enough to buy or to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment, which is about $28 per hour right now at fair market rent. But at that same percentile, at the 60th percentile, Latino workers making $21.84 an hour. And for Black workers, I think it's $22 and some change. I can't remember the exact number. But both of those communities, not even if there was a one-bedroom rental home, again, was $22.67 an hour. So there are huge disparities there. And again, it just like a lot of folks are so much closer to experiencing housing instability and homelessness than I think we realize, and that's like a really tough conversation to have. You know, there's like a lot of integrity, and we want to make sure that we're like maintaining our families. And I think Aaliyah also alluded to this earlier in the earlier panel. Like, we don't want to experience like any embarrassment around not being able to keep up with those payments, but it is really a real conversation we have to have.
Thank you both for sharing insights, and this kind of is a perfect segue into my next question, and I'll direct this one to you, Shanti, surrounding socioeconomic status and just you know, access to credit and low income and vulnerable communities, right? Shanti, could you speak to how does housing displacement intersect with issues of race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status?
Sure. You know, it's a really important question because, you know, as everyone has touched on a little bit already, we know that one's race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status all come into play when we think about housing stability or, you know, vulnerability to displacement. So the socioeconomic status piece of this is pretty straightforward. We know that people with lower incomes and lower wealth in particular, you know, don't have the ability to purchase a home, let alone always have a security deposit or the ability to pay escalating rents in neighborhoods that are gentrifying and increasingly unaffordable. We know that they may lack the higher credit scores due to being credit invisible, so not having a track record of credit in this country, having lower credit scores, or just, you know, really not having trust in the American financial system, right? So all of these issues come into play in terms of the ability to not only rent a home, but, you know, think about purchasing or having financing around your housing. So we see deep disparities in that regard across the board in terms of access to credit, not only for all of those factors, but because of this historical and present day pervasiveness of housing discrimination. So knowing that people of color in particular aren't able to purchase homes, and there's this huge homeownership gap. So it's, you know, around 30% homeownership gap for Black families, around 25% homeownership gap compared to whites for Latinos. And that leaves people of color way more vulnerable as renters to the various sources of displacement. You know, I mentioned as renters because escalating rents can make people, you know, have to leave. But also source of income discrimination, which Sid already mentioned. So, you know, Black families in particular are more likely to have assistance that they need to use to access rents in certain markets, and, you know, discrimination against what income they are bringing and the source of that income is really pervasive. And so that's something that, you know, exacerbates the vulnerability to displacement and the inability for people to live in the neighborhoods where they've lived for a long time or neighborhoods of choice. I would also just say that we have to think about climate when we talk about displacement, and we really need to think about all of the systemic ways that people of color have been segregated into neighborhoods that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate, whether it's disasters that are increasing, whether it is you know, wildfires, you know, a variety of different things that are impacted by climate. And we know that places that were previously redlined are more likely to be hotter as temperatures rise, are more likely to be vulnerable to, you know, flooding and those types of things. And so census tracts that are majority Black, Latino, or Native American experience a 50% greater vulnerability to wildfires. So even though wildfires happen in, you know, places of all different races, the vulnerability of places where there's more people of color is much higher. We also know that hurricanes and floods are almost twice as more likely to displace people who are Black from their homes rather than when compared to whites. So I think climate is something that we really can't ignore in this conversation around displacement. It's not just financial displacement, it's not just discriminatory displacement, but actually our long history of discrimination and segregating our communities is leaving people more vulnerable to the increasing threat of all of those types of factors around climate.
I completely agree. We need to pay more attention to the climate displacement. Going on to another topic, kind of expanding more on looking at the economic forces around displacement. I want to direct my next question to you, Noda. Can you speak to what role economic forces such as gentrification, lack of access to credit for low and moderate income individuals, rising property values, which we talked a lot about today, or just insufficient funds, right, for supplying affordable housing, and what do those different forces play in driving housing displacement?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. It's a really big trend. All of those factors that you outlined, when you think about rising housing costs, income and wealth disparities, and the pressure of gentrification kind of all together. And I'll share two examples of how we see this manifesting and we're like looking to address with the home initiative or issues that we're looking to work on. The first is a situation where there's a family and you kind of do what you think are all the right things. You grow up, you go to school, maybe you get a degree, you get a job, you save your money, you start a family, and then you want to buy a house. And for many in our community, we want to buy a house, perhaps near our family, near where we grew up. But what we're finding is in so many of these communities, the cost of housing has increased some, but even for individuals who sort of have done, quote, all the right things, they can't buy a house, where they grew up. And what we're seeing in a lot of communities is it's sort of changing character of a lot of, Latino neighborhoods, historically, Latino neighborhoods. I know this is true in my own individual family. I mentioned, anyone from California, by the way? Okay, so I grew up in Oakland, in the Bay Area. And growing up, every Sunday we went to my abuela's house. Everybody, all the cousins. And there was no schedule. You just sort of showed up, you showed up. There was always food cooking on the stove. And we kind of came in and out and we all hung out and saw each other every Sunday. Today, we live all over the place. Most of my cousins have moved to the Central Valley, really far out. And why is that? Because of housing costs. And so we no longer have that Sunday dinner at someone's house all getting together. And I know that story is, I hear about it from lots of different folks, if it's in California or other parts of the country. And so, even for those of us who want to be able to go back and live near our families, whether for childcare reasons or other reasons, we're not able to because of the rising costs and just how challenging it is with the income disparities that we see, in our community. So that's something that we see as a challenge. And we think it's a way to also kind of a call to action, in terms of, we want to find ways so that people can, if they want to go back to their communities, are able to do so. And there's some examples, some groups in our affiliate network that are focusing on just that. A second way that we see this issue manifesting, which we're very concerned about, is very really around the loss of wealth. And so we're hearing that in certain communities, think of places like San Antonio, Austin, cities in New Mexico, they historically had really high Latino homeownership rates. Like El Paso, there's no homeownership gap in El Paso. Latinos in El Paso have higher homeownership rates than the white community does. And so you have these communities where for generations, our community has owned homes. But what's happened is Latinos and Black families are much less likely than white families to have wills or to do estate planning. And what we're seeing now is that for a lot of these families, the house just kind of passes through the family without any kind of formal will or estate planning or trust that happens. People just kind of informally live there. And then over time, The house might become disrepair, and maybe someone in the family can't afford to fix it. They apply to a city program to get some funding to help, and you know what, they're not eligible because they're not the title owner of the property. Or they want to do some other investment, or perhaps if they wanted, it's sort of unclear who owns the property. And then when you have, again, in places, Austin, San Antonio, like Exhibit A here, you have the pressure to gentrification. Investors are coming in to buy up properties all in cash. You have family situation where maybe they owe back taxes and they can't afford to clear the title on the property or to pay the taxes. It seems like the easy way out is just to sell to an investor for all cash offer, and usually for less they could have gotten, through a more open process. And so I point that out, that even in places where there is, a good rate of homeownership, there's still risks to our community around gentrification because of those pressures. So with the Home Initiative, we're looking both around how can we find opportunities for young people to either come back to the communities where they're from through encouraging higher density development in many of these places, and how can we protect existing families that have that generational homeownership already in their family, retain that either through estate planning or other ways to prevent the issues around, tangled title and heirship issues.
And this actually is a perfect segue into my next question. And how can we implement measures to prevent the displacement of low to moderate income individuals or families caused by new developments, such as these luxury high rises, right, gentrification that's happening, or by housing acquisitions by private equity groups, which you just mentioned, Rhoda, which can often lead to increased housing costs. If anyone wants to take on and provide some insights into that.
I'm happy to get us started. I think for us specifically at NLHC, one of the advocacy points that we've been working on for a few years has been reforms to the low-income housing tax credit. Because, the name would obviously kind of suggest that it would hopefully help folks with the lowest incomes. But, there's a lot that could be fixed with that particular law that could actually make it, actually serve its purpose, which I think is like making sure that there's like a set aside, like a higher set aside of actual units that are deeply affordable to extremely low income households, so that they're not paying more than 30% of their income on rent. So that's like the biggest one, I think. And also with the low income housing tax credit in particular, I think designating hard to reach areas, especially for those rural areas that might not necessarily always have those resources, especially for Indigenous communities too. That's like a really, really big issue to us. Yeah, I think that's probably like the biggest thing. And I also just wanted to touch on something that somebody said earlier, if that's okay. But I think when it comes to like gentrification, it is very like profit driven. Like it doesn't happen on accident. It's almost like very purposeful. And I think calling it out for what it is important. But I just want to give a shout out to a documentary called Raising Liberty Square, and it's spelled RAZING, Raising Liberty Square, which is about a community in Florida that kind of talks a lot about that intersection of gentrification and climate justice, which Shanti talked about a little bit earlier.
I'll chime in. So thinking about measures to prevent displacement, the first is, helping existing homeowners. On the earlier panel, I can't remember the doctor's name, he talked about tax spaces, promotoras, like, oh, we need that in financial space. And we actually have that. They're called housing counselors. We need a better name for it. We need a little bit of marketing there. But they're actually across the country. Milos US, we are an intermediary for HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have a network of 50 community-based nonprofits that provide financial coaching and housing counseling free of charge. And there are many other institutions out there that also have similar networks. So there are hundreds of them out there. And so, promoting that service of free, unbiased source to existing homeowners so that if they have questions, if they have issues, So I think that's one. I think for us, we very much think that thinking about estate planning as part of the homeownership pre-purchase process would be really beneficial for a lot of families. Again, most, Latino and Black families don't have wills. And, we're kind of left at the mercy of whatever the state dictates, in terms of when someone passes. So I think that would be really important. And then I also think, and this is more maybe at the local level, is thinking about how specific communities can prioritize, housing for people who are going to actually live, homeownership for people who are going to live in the house. So basically, how can we level the playing field a little bit between an institutional investor who's going to come to the table with all cash, with a family who need to have a mortgage, but they're going to live in that house. And I think for a lot of communities, they're going to prefer that homeowner, especially, if it's like a first-time home buyer, they have to level the playing field, because if you're a seller, that all cash offer is really hard to resist, because you're going to close quickly, and kind of be able to move on your life. So thinking about what are some policies, and different communities have kind of focused on that. Right now, we know that there are a lot of institutional investors that hold a lot of, housing, both multifamily as well as single-family homes, as rentals, and it's a very profitable business. And, they're in it as, they're in it as profit, right? This is a market factor. So as I noted much earlier, housing is a cycle. So I anticipate there's going to be a day where being in the, housing for rent business will not be as profitable. And many of those companies are going to want to dump some of those properties. And my fear is they do it in mass, and then they drop property values for everyone all around them. I'm hoping in local communities, they could be more strategic and think about how we partner with either individual homeowners or with nonprofit organizations we know will hold the houses you're going to sell to first-time buyers. So those are the ideas that I saw.
Thank you so much for those incredible insights. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about more so the historical racism and the historical systemic racist policies that have been implemented that have created barriers for, specifically Black and Brown communities to really build wealth and obtain homeownership. So, and there is no denying that discriminatory policies put in place at the federal, state, and local levels have contributed, right, to this fighting racial wealth gap. And homeownership gap. And so Shanti, if you could expand on how can we address these systemic inequalities and discriminatory practices that have contributed to generational harm for underserved communities, and how do we ensure that housing solutions are being done in an equitable and inclusive way?
Sure. Thanks for raising that. I think it makes me think of this headline that you all may have seen a few weeks ago that was pretty much saying something like millennials are set to be the wealthiest generation in our history, or millennials are going to inherit, 60 or $90 trillion worth of assets by 2044. And, I think, I saw this headline in a few different publications, but when you read a little bit further under the byline, it's inheritance automatically bakes in everything that we have done before us, right? So it absolutely will widen inequalities and wealth gaps unless we do something drastically different. It is great to promote homeownership. We are promoting homeownership, but we are also promoting it in a slightly different way in terms of doing things a little bit differently to talk about a more equitable future for all of us, and especially for people who have been locked out of homeownership for so long. So at NAPA, we've been really focused on closing the racial wealth gaps and homeownership gaps through our Keys Unlocked Dreams initiative, which I mentioned before. And a lot of the programs that are out there right now are offering down payment assistance, and it's like a $15,000 forgivable loan or grant, or maybe $20,000, but it's a flat rate and it goes to first-time home buyers who are sometimes income qualified in their areas. Which is great and helps a lot of people. But if we overlay a strategy in some way that really thinks about who's been locked out from the past, who's not going to have access to that intergenerational wealth to achieve homeownership, and really targeting our resources to that group, we have a lot of promise to have a more equitable future by being that a little bit more targeted. So at NAPA, we thought about this issue a lot and have had a lot of folks come to us and say that we want to do something more targeted, but we don't want to run afoul of the Fair Housing Act. We don't want to, run afoul of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which establishes, that we need to, serve all people with the financial products and housing products that we have. So one of the ways that we've been really focusing on is something that was provided under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in the 70s. It's not a new tool, but we've really encouraged the use of it. It's called the Special Purpose Credit Programs, and these are programs that lenders can put into place, acknowledging that there are segments of the population that they do not serve as well, who are disadvantaged in some way from receiving the financial products that they provide, in this case mortgages, or HELOCs and other types of financing that helps people achieve or stay in homes. And so special purpose credit programs, establish that there is a disparity in place and then set up a tool that advantages that group, whether it's a racial group, an ethnic group, gender, et cetera, and allows them to have a product that is more advantageous. So something that gives them, specialized down payment assistance, larger amounts, lower interest rates, lower credit score thresholds. And that really is a way for us to think about our investments in homeownership in a way that redresses our past, in a way that accounts for discrimination in our market, right? So I think it's really important and a really exciting way to expand homeownership if you're working with lenders or even government entities and things like that who are, groups like that who extend credit. We recently finished a project with the state of Washington that is implementing a special purpose credit program across their state to specifically reach prospective homebuyers or renters who are part of the groups that have been marginalized historically in their state. And, some of the analysis in there really shows that it would take 4 times as much money to reach that same population if you had a program that was neutral, that didn't account for the groups that had experienced discrimination. So it is a way to really target resources and be cost effective about closing the racial wealth gap. The second model I'll just mention quickly, Aaliyah in the last panel talked about the Down Payment Towards Equity Act, which puts a first generation lens over the down payment assistance programs. And this is something that can be used across the board. She mentioned a nonprofit in Boston, MAHA, that has used that with their STASH program. But we, a number of state housing finance agencies have adopted first generation programs. And, the effect of that is really that it provides additional assistance to people whose parents have never owned a home, whose parents experienced foreclosure, who were in the foster care system at one point. And so what's great about that is that it really gets at this intergenerational wealth issue in a really targeted way. And so NAFA, along with the Center for Responsible Lending, put together a policy proposal that lifts up some research by the Urban Institute that kind of shows who would benefit from such a program nationally. And so the Down Payment Towards Equity program is a big way we can sort of think about also addressing some of these issues in a more targeted fashion.
Thank you so much for all that information. I will ask the last question and then I'll open it up to the audience. So be thinking of questions to ask our incredible set of panelists. So this will be, I would love to start off with you, Sid, and then if we could go down the line. What are some possible policy or non-policy related solutions to closing the housing shortage? And what would you say are the necessary steps to address these issues? So what should we prioritize? What should we prioritize to ensure that, we're achieving these goals of obtaining more affordable housing? And so if you all can talk about what some of these policies or initiatives that could be implemented at the local, state, or federal levels to incentivize the development of more affordable housing options for individuals across the nation.
So I don't know, but by my title, I don't know if you were able to catch this, but my main job is in analyzing policy all the time. So the majority of what I do at the coalition is really, working with tenants across the country and engaging with them on federal advocacy. And a lot of that is really learning from them on their tenant organizing strategies. And I enjoy that a lot because I think, like, especially like being at the federal level, we're like in our own little bubble and we don't really think about the people power that's like happening on the ground. And I think it's really important to touch on that. And it's also important for us to like not only just have a seat at the table, but like also create like tables where we might have historically not been at before. And a lot of the times, one of the folks that I work with very closely always tells me, you know, like folks who have that lived experience will have like the solutions to the problems, but they won't have like the resources to necessarily be able to like share those solutions with people that need to hear it. So definitely like being engaged in like your local like tenants union or like tenant association is like really huge. And like really building that people power. And why this is important is because historically we've seen that renters actually do not turn out to vote as much as homeowners do. So there's like a huge disparity there, and we need get out the vote. But it really is like an important part of the conversation and actually getting solutions that work both for homeowners and renters. And then I think when it comes to policy, I talked a lot about a few policy solutions in my introduction, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I think, you know, we talked a lot about source of income protections, and there is like federal legislation to hopefully get that through, and it's the Fair Housing Improvement Act. So that's like a big thing. It would prohibit discrimination, not just on source of income, but also veteran status. And there's also the Rent Relief Act, which is a refundable tax credit that can help a lot of cost burden renters who are eligible for federal assistance, but they can't necessarily receive it because of like inadequate federal funding. And then I'm not like the expert on this, but I know we talked a lot about like we briefly touched on like zoning rules and stuff. And at NYHC, we really want to incentivize like local governments to pass zoning rules that aren't, you know, restrictive and actually like enforce or encourage multifamily housing development. And there is like a YIMBY Act that's being, that was introduced in the past. So for those folks that don't know what YIMBY is, it's yes in my backyard. So it's like the opposite of the NIMBY movement, but that's like something that I think that's also important to think about.
Great, so my thoughts are kind of in two buckets, you know, supply and demand. And so on supply, we need to build more housing. For those of you who watched the State of the Union address, was that last month? Yes. The president outlined some proposals around, you know, being able to build more housing. Earlier, Sid talked about the low-income housing tax credit program. And while there's many things we could do to improve that program, it has been a primary driver for building affordable rental housing in this country. And we would very much advocate for a similar program focused on the building of affordable entry-level homes for first-time home buyers. So having something built on the home buying side that's affordable as well as on the rental side. We're also, Legos US, we endorsed the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. It's something we think is really important because in addition to building more homes, it also can help incentivize or support the rehabilitation of houses. There are a lot of places where there are homes, they're just in disrepair, and we don't have great kind of home renovation loan products. And so what can we do? And that's something else we could do is address those of the 203K program I've had, so that folks can buy a house, maybe who are willing to do a little bit of work on it and fix it up and get a loan to be able to do that. At the local level, Sid mentioned zoning. I think that's really, really important. At the end of the day, we can't get out of the problem we're in by building houses the way we always have. We have to be willing to have higher density. We have to be willing to revisit parking minimum requirements, things like that, and just looking at how can we increase density to make housing more affordable and more accessible. And that's something that mostly at the state and local level. On the demand side, I would just outline a few things. One is we're big proponents of housing counseling, so funding for housing counseling, enforcement of the fair housing laws. As Shanti mentioned, we have some great laws on the books, but we have to make sure that we enforce them. And then looking at agencies like the CFPB to make sure that our mortgage policies and regulations are serving all segments of our population, including immigrants, those with limited Spanish-speaking skills, and mixed status families.
Yeah, and Shanti, if you want to chime in as well, and I do want to just be mindful of time and get to some audience Q&A.
Well, the good news is that we've covered a lot of solutions, and most of my things that I was going to go to is lovely other panelists have mentioned. So I would just say +1 on zoning changes, +1 on the Neighborhood Homes or Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, and I would just add that I mentioned earlier that the Fair Housing Act has two parts, so it's both making discrimination illegal and then also affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a requirement for jurisdictions that receive federal funds that are doing housing and community development work. So there's a lot of opportunity in that obligation for jurisdictions to be able to think about things like the zoning reform and supply issues for affordable housing.
So much. Now we have time for maybe one or two questions from the audience, if anyone has a question for our panelists.
Hi, my name is Samira. I just felt like that part about like the developers and like investors coming into like communities and buying up homes. Like I've seen that come up a lot in the news.
And I was just wondering, like, what would the messaging be to convince, like, a family that is selling their home? Like, what would the messaging be to convince them to, like, sell it to another family instead of, like, an investor? Because if you think about it, like, it's a very appealing offer when they pay you in cash. And I entirely agree with you, but I'm just curious as to, like, what can we do living in these communities to advocate for people to like don't sell it to an investor, like
Yes, I'll say three things. The first is for some families who are selling, they actually do care. One of my neighbors sold their house not too long ago, and they had multiple offers, and a bunch of the offers included a letter from the buyer, and they picked a young family because they sort of saw themselves like, oh, this is so. There's some issues with that too, but I'll say that I do think that some sellers do care. The second piece is going back to the State of the Union address. President Biden proposed an incentive for sellers who sell to an owner-occupant buyer. I think it was $10,000 that would be paid, I think, over 2 years as an incentive to sell to an owner-occupant buyer as opposed to someone who isn't going to live in the house. And then, the third piece is I think there are other similar types of incentives. So I know there are programs out there, for example, like nonprofits and others that will come in and almost like mimic the cash offer. So they'll work with a buyer, and so if they have a house, they'll be able to do it's like an all cash offer, but then they work with the buyer kind of behind the scenes and they figure out the mortgage afterwards. And so there are both some private companies that are offering a similar service. Right now the market's a little different, and this is probably more a couple years ago, but some of the private offerings I think you have to look at very, very carefully and closely, just to be sure that they're not taking advantage of families. But I know there's some nonprofits that wanted to set up similar loan funds to be able to kind of mimic that option.
Thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. I know that it was mentioned a bit about how we can't separate climate change with housing, and it was mentioned about how people are pushed to areas that are most impacted by climate change, like floods, hurricanes, wildfires. And in Florida, which is my home state, what we've been seeing a lot of is climate gentrification, where more affluent folk are moving closer to areas like Little Haiti and pushing out those communities. And so what kind of tools are there for communities like that to be able to stay in their communities that they've been building community in for decades?
Well, I mean, I would just say that that's such a great point, and I think we're gonna see a lot more of that, unfortunately, unfolding, outside of Florida as well. So, I would say that it's really important for us to invest in community infrastructure. And I don't mean physical infrastructure alone. I mean, like, really invest in the social networks that are there and encourage, models of community ownership, whether it's, housing as a community-owned asset, like through a community land trust or a co-op or something of that nature, but also the community spaces that are important to keeping people in the places where they live, providing amenities and assets to people to be able to stay there and still like recognize their neighborhood as they stay in their homes. So, that would just be my main piece of advice there.
Just on that, I encourage you to look up, you all remember the wildfires in Hawaii and Lahaina not too long ago. They're set up a community land trust because all these families have lost their homes and it's really expensive to rebuild. And back to the issue, the investors are swooping in, and a bunch of community residents put together a community land trust to try to get the homeowners to sell the land trust to them, and they will then make sure that it's being sold to folks from that community. So there was I think it was a New York Times article I just said a week or two ago about it. So I encourage you to read it as an example of one community trying to fight just that.
And we have, and I'm so happy you brought up Florida again, because the documentary that I mentioned earlier is like directly talking about the Liberty Square community, which is also in Miami. But I do also just want to touch on like the community development block grant program, and then there's like a little subset called the community development block grant disaster recovery program, which took me a while to figure out because it's CDBG-DR and I've been calling it that for years. But the thing about it is that, like I said earlier, a lot of what we do is like advocating for like reforms to the program, but CDBG-DR isn't even like a federally authorized program. And I think, trying to get assistance to survivors of disasters and targeting that to the folks who are in greatest needs is important. And that's one of the things we're focusing on, but also making sure that both CDBG-DR and CDBG in general is like actually allocated to build like programs that would prevent like that displacement. And again, like building like those communities for folks. I'm definitely like a big advocate for like community land trust and like using alternative models, especially because like in that case in particular, we had like a lot of public housing developments that were there, and traditionally in those communities, folks have a really strong social network. So when you start displacing them, it's really hard and it's really sad. So
so much, and I just want to be mindful of time, but if y'all do have more questions, our panelists are maybe going to stay a few minutes after, and y'all can definitely ask them. I just want to give each of our panelists a chance to just give their closing remarks, and if there was one thing you would want this audience to take away from this panel, what would it be? And we can start with Shanti and then go down the road this way.
Sure. Well, I always love being on these panels because I learn a lot as well from my fellow panelists. And so thank you both for bringing so many great ideas and solutions to the table. I think what resonates for me and what I would encourage is that there is not one solution to these issues. I mean, we have to focus on supply, we have to focus on demand, and we have to think about both of these things in terms of the systems that really control them, right? So what are the systemic levers that will have the most impact on both of those things in our communities, and just really focus on throwing everything at those levers in all different ways and bringing people together. And I think this is a unique moment because housing is on everybody's mind, right? So in a new way that we didn't see, maybe we saw it in the foreclosure crisis, but this is the topic that has a lot of attention right now. So we need to leverage this moment and elevate all of these solutions.
I'm happy I went after Shanti because I'll just plus one on everything. That's exactly right on points. And maybe I'll just share one thing that I didn't get to mention that I encourage you all to look at. A few months ago, Unidos US issued a poll. It's the largest poll of Latino voters this cycle. And it's a national poll as well as in around 6 or so strategic states. And a top issue for Latino voters is housing. And so I encourage all of you to take a look at the poll, particularly if you are work for a member or a senator who states one of those we have more state level, and just make sure that they realize how important housing is to the Latino voter in their district and in their states. Thank you then for having me.
And again, just +1 to both of those statements. But again, just like needing really comprehensive and policies that address like a lot of the racism that's kind of like just built up over time, and a lot of like the oppressive policies that have built up over time. Like every time I talk about the history of housing, I'm just like, it was very racist. But I think we have like the power to really be part of like history and like actually start making a change around that. So don't be scared to like push back to folks. And like I don't work in Congress anymore, so I'm not the authority on doing that, but like please like advocate for those things even when it might seem difficult. And I will also say that housing is an issue that impacts a lot of different sectors, so it's important in your everyday work, even if you don't explicitly work in housing, to see how it might connect with it, whether it's in healthcare, education, economic development, criminal justice, etc. Like it impacts everything. So yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much to my incredible set of panelists. Thank you for all the work that you do and all the insights you provided us. And that concludes our session on renting the American dream. I hope you guys took something, gained knowledge, and I really do continue to like advocate and like encourage you all to like stay informed and have these conversations on affordable housing and the current state that we're in. So just muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the briefing. So thank you again.